Global Biodiversity Crisis, Drivers and Solutions. This essay explores the urgent issue of biodiversity loss, often referred to as the sixth mass extinction. Unlike previous extinctions caused by natural phenomena, this crisis is largely driven by human activities, including overpopulation, pollution, habitat fragmentation, and climate change. These drivers interact to destabilize ecosystems, reduce biodiversity, and jeopardize essential functions such as pollination, nutrient cycling, and water purification. The essay begins by examining the impact of human demands and consumption patterns, which set the stage for major biodiversity drivers like pollution and land use change. It then explores specific consequences for terrestrial, marine, and freshwater ecosystems, highlighting the interconnected nature of these impacts. Finally, it discusses potential strategies to mitigate biodiversity loss and restore ecosystem health, emphasizing the need for immediate action. The impact of human demands on biodiversity. Biodiversity is under unprecedented pressure, driven by the ever-growing demands of humanity, without accounting for the environmental costs. Our consumption patterns and population growth have fueled a cascade of environmental changes that threaten the balance of ecosystems. This section examines how the increasing demand for resources triggers major biodiversity drivers, such as pollution, land use change, and fragmentation, leading to far-reaching consequences for global ecosystems and species. 1. Overpopulation and unsustainable consumption. The rapid increase in human population and the associated rise in resource consumption are central to biodiversity loss. More people require more food, water, and land, which intensifies habitat destruction and pollution. The demand for energy and raw materials drives deforestation, mining, and urbanization. This not only destroys habitats but also fragments them, reducing the ability of species to thrive. These consumption patterns have set the stage for the cascading impacts of pollution and habitat fragmentation, consequently leading to man-made climate change. The wealthiest 1% of people are responsible for about 16% of global carbon emissions, underscoring the unequal contribution to environmental damage. Addressing this imbalance is essential to reducing resource overuse and protecting biodiversity. The growth of the global middle class adds to this challenge. While it improves living standards for many, it also significantly increases resource consumption. Emerging middle classes often adopt the consumption-heavy lifestyle of industrialized nations, which has largely driven the current crisis. This rising demand for resources is unsustainable and puts immense pressure on nature, exploiting ecosystems without considering their environmental value. Western and industrial nations have failed to offer attractive and sustainable lifestyle alternatives, further worsening these patterns and deepening the strain on biodiversity. 3. Climate change. Climate change is primarily driven by the increase of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, CH4, in the atmosphere. When sunlight reaches Earth, its energy is reflected back into space as ultraviolet light. Greenhouse gases trap some of these rays and convert them into heat, warming the planet. As the concentration of these gases rises due to human activities like burning fossil fuels, agriculture, and deforestation, more heat is trapped, causing global temperatures to rise and altering the climate on a global scale. This changing climate has profound effects on biodiversity. Rising temperatures, shifts in weather patterns, and more frequent extreme events like droughts, storms, and heat waves are putting immense pressure on ecosystems. Many species are now forced to endure environments that are no longer their optimal habitats. These increasingly challenging conditions significantly reduce their already marginal chances of survival. They experience reproductive stress and physiological strain, and if pushed beyond their physiological tolerance, they face local extinction. Such disruptions weaken entire ecosystems, making them less resilient to future challenges. Coral reefs are highly sensitive to ocean warming. When temperatures rise beyond their tolerance, corals expel the algae they rely on for energy, a process called bleaching. Persistent bleaching leads to coral death and the collapse of reef ecosystems that support around 25% of marine species. Ocean acidification, caused by CO2 dissolving in seawater, further weakens corals by hindering their skeleton formation. For example, repeated bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef in recent years have severely damaged marine biodiversity and harmed local economies dependent on fishing and tourism. Another critical example is the weakening of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, AMOC, a key ocean current that regulates heat distribution globally and significantly influences Europe's climate. The AMOC functions as cold, salty water near Greenland sinks due to its higher density, driving the circulation. Climate change disrupts this process as melting Greenland ice sheets release freshwater, reducing salinity, while warming temperatures lower the density of ocean water. A collapse of the AMOC would lead to dramatic global climate disruptions, affecting weather patterns, ecosystems, and biodiversity, with many species forced to adapt or risk extinction. The AMOC is growing increasingly unstable due to rising greenhouse gas emissions, with a tipping point likely approaching. This poses significant risks to global climate systems and biodiversity. 2. Pollution, a byproduct of human consumption. Pollution is a major driver of biodiversity loss, affecting terrestrial, marine, and freshwater ecosystems in distinct but interconnected ways. In terrestrial environments, agricultural chemicals such as pesticides have significantly reduced pollinator populations, like bees, threatening crop production and ecosystem health. Plastic pollution is a dominant issue in marine ecosystems, where ingestion and entanglement harm species such as sea turtles and seabirds, while oil spills and chemical runoff degrade coastal habitats. Freshwater systems are particularly vulnerable to industrial and agricultural waste, which disrupt aquatic life and reduce water quality. These pollutants accumulate across ecosystems, compounding ecological stress, disrupting food webs, and accelerating the loss of biodiversity. 3. Land use change and habitat fragmentation. Land use change and habitat destruction primarily affect terrestrial ecosystems where forests and grasslands are fragmented by agricultural and urban expansion. These interconnected drivers disrupt habitats, leading to biodiversity loss on a local level but on a global scale. This often leads to what is known as the island effect, where continuous habitats are divided into smaller, isolated fragments, much like islands are separated from the mainland by water. Just as the size and distance of an island from the mainland determine its biodiversity, the size and separation of habitat fragments greatly influence the overall biodiversity within them. When a road cuts through a forest, it creates barriers that make it difficult or impossible for animals to move between fragments. This limits genetic exchange and reduces access to food and mates. Small fragments can only support limited biodiversity as the resources and space available are constrained. This driver has particularly severe consequences for large mammals such as elephants and tigers, which require extensive habitats to survive. For plant species, deforestation reduces seed dispersal and microclimates essential for growth. Additionally, land use change often results in a significant reduction or even complete loss of biodiversity. Agricultural areas, for instance, typically support far fewer species than natural ecosystems due to monoculture practices and pesticide use. Urbanization and land sealing further exacerbate this issue by completely eliminating natural habitats, leaving no space for native species to survive. 4. Invasive species. Invasive species disrupt native ecosystems by outcompeting, preying on, or spreading diseases to indigenous species. The introduction of non-native species often occurs through human activities such as global trade, travel, and agriculture. These species exploit ecological niches with efficiency unmatched by indigenous organisms, leading to significant shifts in community composition and function. For species that have already spread, long-term management strategies such as biological control using natural predators or pathogens can help limit their impact. Early detection and rapid response (EDRR) are critical to minimizing ecological and economic damage caused by invasive species. 5. Overhunting and exploitation. The exploitation of wildlife for food, medicine, and trade exerts immense pressure on biodiversity. A notable example is the overhunting of whales during the 19th and 20th centuries, driven by demand for oil and other whale products, which led to the near extinction of several species, including the blue whale. Modern justifications for hunting, such as population control, remain contentious, particularly in fragmented ecosystems where natural regulatory processes have been disrupted. Addressing overexploitation involves reevaluating these practices and prioritizing ecosystem restoration to ensure sustainable interactions with wildlife. Addressing the biodiversity crisis. To counter the drivers of biodiversity loss, humanity must fundamentally shift its relationship with nature. Reducing overconsumption and transitioning to sustainable practices are key. For terrestrial ecosystems, reforestation and wildlife corridors can restore connectivity and reduce the effects of fragmentation. In marine systems, reducing plastic waste and overfishing while protecting key habitats like coral reefs is essential. Pollution must be curtailed by limiting agricultural runoff and industrial waste. Additionally, global cooperation to mitigate climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions is critical to restoring ecosystem health. Public engagement plays a crucial role in driving conservation efforts. Showcasing success stories like the recovery of wolves in Germany can inspire broader support for biodiversity initiatives. Educating communities about the intrinsic and extrinsic value of biodiversity fosters a culture of coexistence and stewardship. Conclusion. The biodiversity crisis arises from a combination of human-driven factors including overpopulation, unsustainable consumption, pollution, climate change, habitat fragmentation, invasive species, and overexploitation. Each of these drivers accelerates the loss of species and weakens ecosystems, which are crucial for services like pollination, water purification, and climate stability. The interconnectedness of these issues amplifies their impacts, making the crisis more urgent. The growth of the global middle class and the adoption of consumption-heavy lifestyles further escalate resource demands while industrialized nations fail to offer sustainable alternatives. Pollution affects all ecosystems, from chemicals harming pollinators to plastic in oceans and agricultural runoff in freshwater systems. Land use changes fragment habitats, creating barriers for species and reducing biodiversity. Climate change adds another layer of pressure, forcing species to adapt or perish, with examples like coral bleaching and the instability of global systems such as the AMOC. Invasive species and overexploitation exacerbate the strain, disrupting ecosystems and depleting populations. To combat this crisis, humanity must address the systemic roots of biodiversity loss through sustainable consumption, reforestation, pollution reduction, and global efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions. Protecting biodiversity is essential to safeguarding ecosystem resilience and securing the well-being of future generations.